Fantastic. We are live. It is a pleasure to be here today with Dr. Columbus Batiste. How you doing, Dr. Batiste?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. We have an action-packed webinar today to bring to many, many, many people. So the subject of today's, or the title of today's talk is basically how to eat to beat stress and boost resilience. And Dr. Columbus Batiste is an absolute magician. And he communicates his message very clearly. So if you guys don't know who he is or you haven't heard him talk in the past, I think you're in for a very pleasant surprise today. Dr. Columbus Batiste is a board-certified doctor in cardiology and as well as interventional cardiology. Since 2008, Dr. Batiste has served as the chief of cardiology at the Kaiser Permanente Riverside and Moreno Valley Medical Centers down in Southern California. He's also shaped the careers of future physicians as an assistant clinical professor at the University of California Riverside School of Medicine. So we're super honored to have him here with us today, and we got an action-packed presentation that he's going to be giving us in just a little bit. So far, we have about 180 people here, which is great. I think we're expecting probably a little bit over 500 people here today. So as more and more people come in, we're going to get to see a lot of comments. Now, if you're just joining us here, today, this is what you're going to learn in today's webinar. Number one, how to gain a better understanding of how stress impacts your brain, as well as your hormones and other critical systems in your body, and how stress can actually increase your risk for the development of many chronic diseases. You also learn Dr. Batiste's formula for countering emotional and physical stress with resilience. And he'll go into detail about what that exactly means. He'll also talk about the one thing that you can do every day to tip the scales in the favor of resilience. And he'll also talk about which foods can contribute to mounting stress levels and which foods actually help boost your resilience as a human being. I've actually never heard this presentation before, so I'm pretty excited myself. Now, if you have any specific questions that you'd like Dr. Batiste to answer during this webinar, then please write your question in the Q&A box in Zoom. So I think at the bottom of your window, there's a Q&A button. So if you click on that, you can then type in your question. And we have a whole team of people in the background who are going to be looking at the questions as they roll in. And we're going to do a Q&A session at the very end so that we can hopefully get to as many questions as possible. But before we go any further, in the chat box right now, please tell us your name and tell us where you're from, because I always like to see, who's here and how international of an audience we have. So there's about 225 of you guys right here. So tell us your name, tell us where you're from, because we want to see all of it. We got Allison from Atlanta, Deanna from Albany, Oregon, Debbie from Oregon. We got people from Germany, California, Mexico City, St. Louis, Missouri. I cannot read this fast. Oh boy.
Wisconsin. Yes.
Nashville, Charlottesville, California. Wow. Oh, wow. I got Panama City. Nice work. Winnipeg, Canada, Corvallis, Oregon. Great. Yeah, keep these coming. This is really cool. Looks like we have a truly international audience here. I love seeing how far, the Forks Over Knives really reaches, because it's not just people in California. It's not just people in the United States. It's people all over the world. And we're actually giving out an award today to anybody from, name a country. Name an obscure country.
Let's see. Guatemala.
Guatemala. That's what he says. Okay. My wife said Iceland. So if you're from Iceland or Guatemala, we're going to give you a giant high five. And if you're not, you can fool us. Okay. So now here's another question for you guys. If you are plant-based, meaning that you eat a diet that is predominantly plants, it doesn't have to be 100% plant-based, but it's predominantly plants, because you've been following the Forks Over Knives methodology and lifestyle, put the number 1 in the chat box. If instead you are eating a sort of meat-based diet or a dairy-based diet, put the number 2 in the chat box. And if you're maybe somewhere in between and are, a little bit of both sides, put the number 1.5 in the chat box. Looks like we're getting predominantly 1s, and now a bunch of 1.5s are flooding in. And there's a fair number of 2s as well. So my spider senses are telling me that we are mostly, It's hard to tell. Mostly 1.5s. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Looks like mainly 1.5s with a little bit of on both ends. So it's kind of a sort of traditional bell curve here, which is cool. For those of you that are 1.5, I'm going to give you a giant high five. For those of you who are ones, I'm going to give you a double high five. And then for those of you who are twos, maybe we're going to learn a little bit today about how you can maybe start to move towards the 1.5 and maybe even get towards a 1 to be fully plant-based, where the bulk of the magic really happens. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Cyrus Kambata. I have a PhD in nutritional biochemistry. I myself have been living with type 1 diabetes for 16 years at this point. I first started out eating a low carbohydrate diet because that's a sort of conventional wisdom in the diabetes world. And then I started eating a plant-based diet and started feeling like $1,000,000. Not only did I gain more energy, but I reduced my insulin use, which was contrary to what I thought was going to happen. I've been able to increase my insulin sensitivity by more than 600% over the course of time. I myself am the co-founder of a business called Mastering Diabetes, which is an online group coaching program for people living with all forms of diabetes to transition towards a plant-based diet. And today I'm going to be your webinar host. I'm just going to be here to navigate this whole situation here. And the bulk of the focus is going to be today on Dr. Columbus Batiste. So before we get started here, we'll get started in about 1 minute. I want to let you guys know that we have a really good deal happening in the Forks Over Knives online shop today. So stay tuned. At the end of the webinar, I'm going to give you some insight here about how you can save 20% on your next order of anything at the Forks Over Knives online store. And again, we'll get to that at the very end of the presentation. But now that we have more than 300 people here ready to learn, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Batiste here. So Dr. Columbus Batiste has performed over 2,000 coronary interventions and hundreds of pacemaker implantations over the course of his career. But as he's been doing, traditional cardiology, he's also noticed that his patients were sort of moving through this revolving turnstile of just increased medication needs and more procedures over the course of time. So at a certain point, he decided to break this cycle and actually start to promote a long-term sustainable solution for his patients using nutrition, using stress reduction, and using exercise. Dr. Batiste has reviewed the medical literature up and down, and he has started to understand and communicate to the world the undeniable benefits of a predominantly plant-based diet. His mission is to share this information so that each one can teach one about the benefits of plant-based nutrition, daily exercise, and stress reduction, and therefore provide everyone with the opportunity to take full control of their long-term health. He's called the Healthy Heart Doc. And he is a highly sought-after speaker at medical conferences and at public events all around the world. We're super honored to be here with him today. So thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Batiste.
My pleasure. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'll go ahead.
So, yeah, go ahead. Let's share your screen and you can take over.
All right. So I hope everyone's doing well. I appreciate Forks Over Knives and Cyrus for hosting this and having me. I love to talk about the heart. That's what I do. And so one of the things, as I kind of start off, we always give disclosures whenever we give medical talks. And so one of the disclosures I'm going to give is that I am a firm endorser of this term called wonderment. And so wonderment is kind of seeing the unfamiliar and the familiar. It's that process of that aha, of seeing something different that's common to you. So one analogy I kind of give is, when my wife puts on a new dress or changes her hair, the same woman I've been with for 20 some odd years, I'm seeing someone slightly different. It leaves me in a state of wonderment. And so I have a distinct habit of engaging in wonderment whenever I look at anything in particular. And so my family, we like to watch movies. And I don't know if any of you out there have seen this one movie out there. It's not well known, but some have seen it. And it's called The Avengers, Infinity War, The Endgame. And so my family and I went out to go and see this movie when it first came out about a year ago. And so let me tell you a little bit about this movie. So this movie, you have this arch villain named Thanos. And Thanos is this ultra super being who goes all over the universe to collect something called Infinity Stones. And what he's looking to do is he wants to destroy all the planets. So fast forward, we're watching this movie, my daughter, who's 13 at that time, my son, who's 11 at that time, and my wife, and I'm sitting next to my daughter, and all of a sudden she starts to grab hold of my arm, and she's not the touchy-feely kind, and she grabs my muscles like Thanos, and in a moment she starts to cry. She cries, just a voracious cry, tears, sobbing horribly at that point in time, and she says to me, "Daddy, why? Why did Thanos kill all those people? Why did he destroy all of those planets?" as she's literally crying in the movie theater. And I stop, I pause for a moment as I'm trying to collect my thoughts, and the first thing that blurts out is, "Stress, baby, stress." You see, Thanos was stressed. And she says, "Stress?" I said, "Yes, stress." You see, stress is this common phenomenon where our demands outweigh our resources. When we have to get home for work, or we have to go pick up the kids from work, and the kids need to be picked up by 3 o'clock, but we don't get off until 5 o'clock. When our bills may total $1,000 at the end of the month, but all we bring home are $500, that's stress. Stress is simply our demands minus our resources. And so I said, Thanos was indeed stressed. You see, on Thanos' planet, you see, Thanos was seeing the gap between the rich and the poor continue to widen, somewhat like we see here inside our world. He was seeing this gap widen where the rich were unwilling to share their resources with those who are less fortunate. You see, Thanos lived in a world that was slowly degrading, where those in positions of power somehow were unwilling to recognize that, yes, indeed, we must change our ways if we are indeed to save this planet. Thanos was tired of seeing resources being burnt up and the lack of it for the future generations. He felt there wasn't enough to go around. You see, in that moment, Thanos was tired of seeing an overfed but yet malnourished nation. He was tired of seeing those around the world continue to adopt the practices of the elite that led to them being overfed and malnourished, leading to all sorts of disease. You see, Thanos was tired of seeing the inhumane treatment of animals. He was tired of seeing the contribution of greenhouse gases to the animals, the way in which the animals were herded and taken care of. He was tired of seeing the resources lead to the degradation of the planet. And so Thanos was indeed stressed. He was tired of seeing sick care in comparison to health care. He was tired of seeing a situation in which we were putting Band-Aids, where we were playing and delivering reactionary medicine as a result of poor lifestyle in a great number of cases, as opposed to creating wellness and proactively looking to treat the underlying cause. Thanos was stressed. He was stressed in that moment. He was indeed stressed. It's something that we all can relate to, this idea of being stressed, of being out of sorts, of feeling as if the demands on our lives outweigh our resources, our capabilities, our human capacity. You see, this thing called stress that happens, I always characterize it as it's an internal reaction to an external stimuli. And so when he saw this stress, you see, there's a whole process that begins to happen. From the first moment on that planet when he saw this stress, it triggered in his mind this lockbox called the amygdala that carries the emotions right there. It started this whole process to unlock a cascade of hormones surging throughout his system of cortisol that then caused the heart to beat faster and other phenomena. In that moment, what he saw is that his eyes dilated. His vision got very precise in that moment. His breathing became fast. His mouth may have become dry in that moment. Lack of sleep. Everything became stiff as he prepared for this fight or this flight. You see, in that moment, very similar to my daughter who experienced this, we relate to others around us. It's called empathy. And so she related to what was going on and saw the destruction that was there. This thing called fight or flight can be very effective when done and when started during an acute phase. But when persistent, when chronic, when unalleviated, this stress hormone cascade on a chronic basis can lead to disease. You see that the hormone that leads to the heart beating faster and the vessels crimping leads to something called high blood pressure. You see, this thing called the stress hormone cascade that causes you to increase your awake state limits your ability to fall asleep. This thing called the stress hormone cascade that mobilizes the blood sugar inside your liver and pancreas in a process that happens so in that way it can prepare the muscles for running or for fighting, leads to a diabetic state. And so on a persistent level, this thing called stress can be detrimental to our bodies. This thing called stress can be so powerful, so powerful that it strikes our hearts. You know, growing up as a kid, I remember oftentimes sitting back and I'd hear about a love story similar to Romeo and Juliet. You know, there's someone who they've been married for 50 years, for 20 years, for 30 years, the love of their life, and their loved one passes away. And next thing you hear is that their spouse who was left passed away of a broken heart. We've heard this, they died of a broken heart. I had broken hearts many times growing up in school as I tried to date many people unsuccessfully. And this broken heart, we characterize it. We almost romanticize it. But around the 1990s, we found that this thing called the broken heart syndrome is indeed a real phenomenon. You see, we find it happens more in women. We find that it happens during an acute stressful event like the loss of an animal, a pet, the loss of a loved one, an acute emotional outburst that may happen at work or in the family ties, and it leads to the sudden destruction of the heart itself. We call this Takotsubo disorder or stress-induced cardiomyopathy. You see, as you look at the screen and you see to the top left, the heart fills nicely, and to the top right, it squeezes the blood out of it. Normally, it's between 55 to 70%, never 100%, but it squeezes out most. But in this syndrome where one develops acute stress, that heart that fills no longer is able to squeeze. It actually balloons out. Something we characterize in calling the apical ballooning syndrome or Takotsubo or broken heart syndrome. It's induced and brought about by acute stressors is what we see distinctly. This thing is a result, this issue of stress is something that is so pervasive. There are estimates that it has some involvement in up to 60% of all illnesses. We see it on a daily basis as physicians, as providers, that an underlying cause or reason for people presenting to the doctor's office oftentimes deals with stress. Our kids are stressed, our dogs are stressed, social media stresses them, lack of sleep, all these things, and it's costing our society billions of dollars as it relates to it. Although we have an international audience, we know some of the common stressors for Americans, and I would be willing to guess this is something that translates across country borders. Too many responsibilities, problems with finances, problems at work, health problems for other people in your immediate family, problems with your family, and being unhappy with the way that one looks. All these things contribute to a great deal of stress that Americans are seeing. This stress, when our demands exceed our resources, leads to stress. And so as a result of all this, I propose that the literature tells us that this is related to disease. And so I want to propose a new equation, stress equation, and that our health is tied to our stress in the form of our health equals our resiliency divided by our stress. As our stress on the bottom of that equation increases, our health decreases, is what we clearly see. As our stress increases, our health decreases. So we have to figure out what we're doing in life. Is it adding to our resiliency or is it adding to our stress? It's so profound that even if one perceives stress differently, I always tell this story briefly. I remember being in training. I remember the first time in training, I was up literally for about 40 hours straight. And in that moment, I'm driving home sleepless. This is before the era of putting constraints on physicians, the amount of time that they could work. I'm driving home tired, the windows down, trying to blow a cold air to keep myself awake. And I'm speaking to my sister in that moment, and she's telling me about asking if I took care of X, Y, and Z. And I said, don't you know what I was doing? I was busy. I was up all night. I was stressed. And she said to me in that moment, I was stressed too. I have a young baby at home. If I don't get sleep, something bad can happen to her. And in that moment, I didn't get mad. I realized that stress is an individual thing. It's how we perceive it. And this is precisely what data tells us. It tells us that for individuals who perceive a heightened sense of stress, especially in low and middle income countries, they are at high risk for multiple chronic disease conditions. Other studies have shown us that individuals having long-term perceived stress and this high level had nearly an 11% increased risk of cancer that was there compared to those with lower stress levels. When we continue to look in general in terms of what happens with stress and diabetes, we found that self-perceived permanent stress, it's an important long-term predictor of diagnosed diabetes independent of socioeconomic status. That means BMI or other conventional risk factors. That means irrespective of your job title, of your thinness, or of your other issues, that stress, this perceived stress, increases one's risk. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt, in addition to Takotsubo disorder, this stress-induced cardiomyopathy, this broken heart syndrome, that perceived stress in heart disease is significant. That multiple studies have shown this old-time hypothesis. This was one of the original thoughts when we entered the phase of heart disease and having death and recognizing it as a distinct entity. We looked at the level of stress and tried to restrict that. That old thought process is coming back, and we're realizing there was still a lot of truth to that on top of the other physiologic findings that we've had. That high perceived stress is associated with an increased incidence of coronary heart disease. This thing called stress is deadly. This thing called stress leads to an increased risk of stroke. 14 studies, including a meta-analysis, show that psychosocial stress is independently associated with an increased risk of stroke. It's also independently increase a risk with stress, that is, with cognitive impairment. That those who have high and persistent levels of stress are more likely to forget things. They're more likely to not really remember things that they should as they grow older, compared to those who are less stressed. How we respond to our external stimuli internally becomes important. This thing called stress, we know the higher our stress, the poorer our health. And what do we do oftentimes, many of us do when we get stressed? We go for our favorite something. That may be a sweet thing. It may be a processed thing. I call processed is ultra-processed is pre-chewed food. It is a food that melts in your mouth, not in your hands, is what it indeed is. And so we find that we all tend to make poor decisions when we're stressed. Studies are shown even in Northern California, Stanford, Batiste showed the fact that individuals who are put in stressful states, despite their desire to eat healthfully, instinctively chose chocolate cake over fruits and vegetables, over 80% in the group that was stressed compared to those who were not stressed. Stress is powerful in our choices. And so our food plays a role in our stress. And because guess what? Stressed is simply desserts spelled backwards. It's a palindrome. Stressed and desserts go hand in hand. And so we find that, yes, indeed, there can be something I characterize as nutritional stress that adds to it. Now, this thing called nutritional stress, it is not just eating the disease-forming foods. It is also not eating the health-promoting foods. That becomes important as it relates to stress and nutritional stress. So once again, nutritional stress, it is indeed eating disease-forming foods, but it is also not eating the health-promoting foods. A lot of times I'll say to individuals, I'll say, we focus so much in life on one concept. We'll say, I'm not eating this. I'm not eating that. Oh, I don't eat that. I don't eat this. Well, what do you eat for your health? We need to shift and change the paradigm. We need to focus on what we are doing that's positive for our health, for our life, for mankind, as opposed to what we're not doing. Change that negative into a positive becomes exceptionally important. And so, yes, indeed, our health is tied to our resiliency over our stress, and our nutrition can contribute to our resiliency as well as to our stress. You know, you may not believe me. You may be saying, well, I don't know about that, Doc. Well, I see it every single day. You see, our society has moved towards foods, a fast food nation. We've become a fast food nation. We've become a quick serve. And you say, well, I don't eat out. I don't eat out. But we bring our fast food from the grocery store back into the home. And we're eating highly processed, refined foods that are high in salt, sugar, and fat is what we end up doing. Now, many of us think that we have a choice. And we like to look down if some of individuals who reach a certain level of heights in their nutritional awareness sometimes will look down on others. And they'll say, we think that they have a choice and you need to just make a better choice. But sometimes, do we really, when we live in environments filled with weapons of mass destruction, that littered down every other corner are fast food places. There are places that have highly refined foods, and they're lacking knowledge as well as the availability of fresh produce. That we think they have a choice, but when these foods are more cost effective for them, that they can buy multitudes of burgers and fries and pizza and variables like that for little pennies on the dollar, but yet to have a health promoting food, there's costs associated with it. Do they really have a choice when they're given that situation? So it becomes important, but these things are upon the principle of salt, sugar, and fat. That's really what the enemy is. This trinity of evil that impacts us is filled with salt, sugar, and fat that leads to a level of addiction. I never forget, as a young resident, I remember hearing someone, this is now some 25 years ago, they mentioned that I'm addicted to chocolate. And I never forget, I can remember like it was yesterday, rolling my eyes saying, just put it down. There's no such thing as addiction. There's not. More and more evidence is telling us that the foods that we eat are equally as addictive as some of the drugs. Tell yourself for a moment you're not going to eat something. And what happens to you when you're just starting out? What do you start to crave? What happens when you go to that one restaurant, that one vendor, that one street corner salesman, that one supermarket or grocery store, and they have that one thing you've been craving? What do you do? What are you inclined to do? Right? It becomes important, this manufacturing of addiction. The food we eat is important. It also creates stress in our bodies. You see, this thing, remember, our health is tied to our resiliency over our stress. I just told you that nutrition adds to our stress, right? And so this food actually literally creates stress in our bodies. And so there was a small study, albeit, right, if I'm truly scientific, it was a very small study, not replicated highly, but it was very interesting, where they took individuals and they divided them into groups where they had plant-rich protein. It was actually lentils as opposed to black beans in the picture, for those of you who are astute. And they compared it to those eating meats. And what they did was they checked the salivary cortisol level. And what they found is that the salivary cortisol level shot up with those taking in the animal protein. Those ingesting the plant-rich protein stayed low in their response to the salivary cortisol level. Did not increase. Now remember, that cortisol is that stress hormone. That cortisol is that thing I mentioned to you all at the very beginning that drives the heart rate to beat faster. It's that thing that drives the blood pressure to be higher. It's that thing that drives the blood sugar to be elevated. That is indeed what that cortisol level does. It's that thing that keeps you awake and keeps you in that hyperacute awareness state. And so when persistent in things that add to the stress cascade can indeed be food. There's other smaller studies that have looked at the impact of ultra-processed food. Remember, though, that thing, once again, that's prepackaged. It can survive a nuclear holocaust. It's that thing that stays on your shelf for an eternity. It's the thing that melts in your mouth, not in your hands. Sort of pre-chewed, those chips, the candy bars, all those things have been shown equally as well to potentially trigger this. Now, on another level, we see that what else can food do to contribute to this stress in that denominator? Because our health is tied to our resiliency over our stress. We see that from an oxidative stress. That oxidation, for those of you who may not know, is a natural process that we see occur. It happens to pipes when they're out and they become oxidized and we see rust form. It happens when you cut fruit open and you leave it out for a while, those bananas or the apple, it becomes oxidized after a while. This thing called oxidative stress, what happens is these free radicals basically are deficient. They're unsteady, and they want to go around and they want to get steady again, right? They want to make themselves even balanced. So they float around our system, attacking our system, our healthy cells, snatching what's good and taking it as their own, damaging the healthy cells. That's what indeed these free radicals do. They damage. But when we build up the antioxidants in our body, these are things that they say, I will stand and sacrifice myself for the healthy cell, and you, free radical, take it from me. And they will give up their own electrons in that moment in order to balance out and prevent the death and degradation of cells. So antioxidants become important, but the foods we eat can contribute. We know ultra-processed foods, we know smoking, we know excessive radiation, we know a lot of many things, lack of sleep, can contribute to this oxidative stress that, yes, indeed, our foods contribute to oxidative stress. Now, how about this thing that oftentimes happens in the summer months around the world, specifically in the United States? We see a lot of grilling happening, a lot of barbecuing, and folks like to throw things on the grill and get that perfect singe, that browning that's there. And what we're doing is we're creating this thing called the Maillard reaction, this browning phenomenon. The same thing occurs in the lining of your vessels, producing advanced glycated end products. Ages you. AGE. It ages you in that sequence when we see these things occur, and it's been distinctly associated with blood pressure elevation. It's been distinctly associated with diabetes, with obesity formation, is what we've seen the relationship between these browned and grilled foods, especially animal products in that particular instance. What studies have increasingly told us is that we are no longer just solely human DNA. We actually live in a state of symbiosis, which means a sort of peace treaty with bacteria in our bodies. And some studies have even intimated that we have actually more bacterial DNA than we have human DNA. It brings my mind, I told you, we were movie buffs, and I see nutrition and health and everything. And so there was another movie called Venom. And this alien from outer space, they came in and they were looking for the perfect host. And they didn't match with every host. And so some hosts, they cause destruction. So some bacteria will cause destruction. But in the perfect host, in the right setting, that venom in this movie blended perfectly to fight crime. So in our body, we have bacteria. That when we have the right bacteria that's cultivated by fiber-rich foods, by plant-rich foods, it can help fight, indeed, disease and death. But there is one in particular called TMAO, a process that happens from carnitine, and that's from the ingestion and choline, the ingestion of animal products primarily, although that's present in most substances. But in that process of metabolization inside the body, it leads to something called trimethylamine N oxide that then has been directly linked to the atherosclerotic process, that hardening of the vessels, that clogging of the vessels that can impact the kidneys, lead to stroke, lead to heart attacks. And so it becomes important. The foods we eat can lead to stress that impacts our health. Well, what about this thing called sugar? We all love sugar. We all love sugar. And so what studies have shown with sugar, most recent and most important is around 2014, 2015, is we found that yes, indeed, as we increase the amount of sugar in our diet, right? As we increase our dietary caloric intake beyond the 8%, but up to the 15, 20%, which is fairly easy to do because 1 teaspoon of sugar equals 4 grams, right? So when your label on the back says 16 grams, 20 grams, that's 4 teaspoons of sugar, right? When we look at what's the amount of calories associated, roughly around 16 calories, and you do the math, you roughly get around 20 teaspoons, which is easy to get from additives to our products, that now you're placing yourself at risk for heart disease. It becomes phenomenally important. The foods we eat, eating them in the natural form, unprocessed, unrefined, becomes important. What about this thing called salt? We know there's this distinct relationship between salt and blood pressure, and that some individuals in our society have a salt sensitivity gene. As they ingest the salt, they increase their blood pressure. 1 teaspoon of salt equals roughly about 2,000 milligrams of sodium. We know too as well that reducing the salt can dramatically impact and lower the blood pressure. It can dramatically been estimated to save lives globally by reducing our sodium intake to less than 1,500 milligrams per day. Now, when you're eating a highly refined, when you're eating an unrefined whole food plant-based diet, you don't have to worry about salt that's pre-added to your food, because most individuals say, I don't add salt to my food, doc. And they're right, it's already inside of it. What about our meats, our red and processed meats? Red meat is more than just your beef. It's also your lamb. It's also your pork, and the processed meats too as well. We know there's this distinct relationship between overall cancer mortality, cardiovascular mortality, upwards of 20% in processed meat, upwards of 18% in red meat. Significant risk that's associated. Am I eating foods that are health promoting, or am I eating foods that are impacting me adversely? Becomes important. What we know beyond a shadow of a doubt is the higher the nutritional stress, the poorer our health. The higher our nutritional stress, the poorer our health, because our health is tied to our resiliency divided by our stress. As a result of all these things, we know that heart disease is a major killer. 1 in 4 have major heart disease. We see that there is an association distinctly, right, with our food choices and the rise in heart disease. Heart disease is still the #1 killer, despite the fact that we know 80% of heart disease can be preventable. We know too as well, blood pressure is exceptionally high, that roughly 1 in 3 have high blood pressure. We know too as well that many have no idea that they have an elevated blood pressure. Multiple studies have been formulated to try and emulate a whole food plant-based diet to show that yes, by adopting more fruits and vegetables, that one can reduce markedly the amount of blood pressure that then leads to kidney failure, that then leads to heart disease. These are extremely important. These are the results of nutritional stress. Diabetes. 1 out of 11 have diabetes. It's what my dad died of. My father-in-law, the same year my father died, my wife's father, passed away of kidney failure as a result of elevated blood pressure. This thing called diabetes basically equals heart disease as far as a physician is concerned. 1 out of 11 have diabetes, but yet 1 in 4 or 5 have no idea that they have it. 25 to 30% have no awareness that they have diabetes, and they're walking around with it. Another about 89 million Americans have prediabetes. And let me stop for a moment and tell you about a touch of diabetes. People like to say, I just have a little bit of diabetes. I have a little bit of high blood pressure. I have my waist is a little bit enlarged with my stomach. That's there. My cholesterol is a little abnormal. And what I want to tell you folks today is that a little equals a lot, because there's something called metabolic syndrome, which is the additive nature of a little. And what we find is that this thing called metabolic syndrome, when you have all these littles, it adds up to an astronomically heightened risk of heart disease. We have to be aware and pay attention. But it's never too late to change the direction that you're going in. It's never at all. And so just like in the story with Thanos, there was a moment in time when he snapped his fingers and destroyed half of all living things across the universe. He did that because he was so distraught and stressed over what was transpiring that from his home planet. As he traveled from planet to planet, the stress he experienced on his planet, the memories came flooding back as he went planet to planet. And he vowed never to let that happen again. So that's why he saw on this malicious intent, and why my daughter was crying when she saw her favorite heroes vanish. Now, fortunately, there was a group of individuals who were there to fight this terror. And this group was called the Avengers, and we have our own group of Avengers within the plant-based world and within the environment and others. We have the likes of, that you've heard many times before, of Esselstyn and of Ornish and of many other giants in our field who have fought. And amidst the Avengers, there was one, and his name was Dr. Strange. And so some may call you strange, but that's okay, because you may have the answer. And he said, there is one way in which we can win this fight, and we can reverse what Thanos has done. And what I'm here to tell you is that there is indeed one way that Thanos, there was two ways, because Thanos did not have to kill half the world. He could have done something else. He could have started a movement similar to what Forks Over Knives has started. And he could have said, you know what, we need to build on our resiliency. We need to start with our spiritual, emotional, our physical resiliency. It's not just one thing. It's not just food alone. It's how we choose to treat one another. It's not just food alone. It's how we choose to move. It's not just food alone. It's how we choose to interact. But today we're focusing on this one aspect, it's nutritional resiliency, because our health is tied to our resiliency divided by our stress. And so as we see, we know that there is so much power in the food, and more studies are uncovering just what we've always observed. That simply there was a study that looked at the intake of blueberries. They extrapolated out and took vitamin C, and they measured the amount of stress hormone level, the reactivity under stressful situations, along with blood pressure. And they found that those who ingested the active ingredients from blueberries compared to those who did not had a faster recovery from their stress. They found that their blood pressure was not as elevated. They found all these benefits. This mirrored a study that was done in conjunction with the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine that went in and transformed a workplace filled with stress, stressors of getting the job done, and they put them on a whole food plant-based diet. And in a moment, these individuals, after completing the trial, they found that their emotional well-being was markedly improved compared to those who did not engage on the whole food plant-based diet. There's power in what we do. There's power in what we do. These carbohydrates that are rich, carbs are not bad, garbage is bad, right? So these foods, a whole food plant-based diet is rich in carbohydrates that's been shown to increase your serotonin, right? The happy feel that you're gonna get. It's gonna increase these things that help you. And yes, those ultra-processed foods also can increase it, but they will drive you up and down, and they lead to other deleterious effects. Not beneficial. What some have shown, and American Institute of Cancer researchers show that basing our diets around plant foods, whole grains containing fiber and other nutrients can reduce our risk of cancer. This has been shown time and time again as it relates to our cruciferous vegetables, our mushrooms, our onions and garlic, and in the form of how they can impact our disease process. We know that whole grains can decrease the all-cause in cardiovascular mortality. We see this in studies. Multiple studies have shown and validated this. We know that our fruits and vegetables, right, they decrease our all-cause mortality and our cardiovascular mortality. As we increase, are you feeding the good guys or feeding the bad guys becomes important. We know that it decreases our blood sugar. We know that it decreases the incidence of diabetes. And Cyrus, he was right. You don't have to stay away from fruits and vegetables and the good stuff if you're diabetic. You don't have to stay away if you're hypertensive or you have other chronic disease. This is precisely what you want, is you want to have these things. We know that our foods, our choices play a distinct role in what happens to us. Multiple studies even looking at in terms of, now we look at nuts, right? We're talking about 1 tablespoon, 2 tablespoons, 3 tablespoons. We're not talking about a can. We're not talking about salted, honey roasted, various things of that nature that are there. Seeds predominantly for giving omegas. But one has to always ask yourself, what question am I asking? These are very highly caloric substances. If I'm trying to lose weight, I may be very diligent in not having certain things, even within the realm. But it becomes important. Finally, what we know overall is we know that for those of you who listed 2, that you're perhaps you still engage in dairy and animal products and so forth, that's there. You have some who are 1.5 and some who are 1. What I can tell you distinctly is from what the Adventist Health Study has shown us is that as you begin the process of moving from eating any and everything, which is the orange bar, right, down to the green bar, which is a plant-predominant diet, as you begin that process, that journey, we find that the weight begins to fall off on average. We know from this Adventist Health Study that as you begin to move from eating any and everything down to a plant-predominant diet, the green bar, all of a sudden the diabetes seems to dissipate. We know that from the Adventist Health Study that as we begin the process of moving from eating any and everything down to a plant-predominant diet, we see that blood pressure elevation begins to drop. The need for medications begins to drop is what we begin to observe. Powerful. When we see, as you begin the process of moving from eating any and everything down to a plant-predominant diet, we see that our cholesterol levels likewise begin to reduce and drop off, right? And we know that the higher the cholesterol, there is a relationship distinctly to cardiovascular events, strokes and heart attacks and heart failure. We know that certain components are equally as detrimental that are there, but we see these processes begin to shift and go downward, and that parallels the lower likelihood of cardiovascular events that also is observed. You know, this inside of a randomized trial that's been repeated inside of India, that Dean Ornish led out, and that's been one of our phenomenal trials that at the end of the day, it showed an improvement, that individuals' lives were changed. He didn't do what traditional medicine says, which is, I want to have the reductionist mindset. I want to look at just one ingredient. I want to look at one sole thing to see if this is going to help improve the outcome. He said, I want to look at your nutrition. I want to look at how you deal with stress. I want to look at your smoking. I want to look at how you're exercising and moving. I want to see how you're loving and decreasing your hating. And what he found from the completion of his program, that those who learn to engage, 82% show reversal and improvement of their blood flow to their heart muscle. Phenomenal. And what's even important is the fact that he found that those, when you separate out, who were really looking at the social connection, this lack of aloneness, dealing with depression, anxiety, it was profound in their outcomes as well. There's power. There's power. To still align in this verbiage, and I'm not sure who originated it, but I heard it from a colleague of mine, and I love it, so I'll give him credit. But it's time for us to get a little bit selfish. We have to get into ourselves a little bit. We have to focus on our sleep and getting 7 to 9 hours, decreasing that stress hormone cascade, balancing out that hunger hormone versus the fullness hormone in ghrelin and leptin. We have to engage in our exercise. And even though that's the evil E word, I don't like saying it a lot of times, but this exercise is movement. This means standing, engaging in non-exercise activity, thermogenesis, just moving around, cooking, things of that nature. We have to engage in these things. If you have a sedentary job, you have to get up and move something on a regular basis. We want the L for love. How are you choosing to view others around you or situations? Love's a choice. It's a choice. And finally, our food becomes important. Are we eating foods that are health promoting? What are we eating for our health, right? We have to get beyond the labels of saying I'm vegan, which means I'm standard American diet vegan style. We have to get beyond labels of saying I'm vegetarian, which means standard American diet vegetarian style or gluten-free style or whatever it is. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty of whole food plant-based diet. And so finally, I'll leave you with one story, and this is up close and personal. My own sister, who knew all this stuff, but allowed herself through the life stressors of having a business at home, of homeschooling 3 gorgeous daughters who've gone on to do great things, that she allowed herself to go and allowed her weight to balloon up on the precipice of having major chronic disease. But in one striking moment, she finally had an aha moment. It didn't matter what I said to her, what she already knew, but she had that aha moment that got her on the road to recovery, and she decided to engage in herself. She decided to make sure she got her sleep. She decided she was going to make sure that she exercised. She decided that she was going to change her relationships to make sure that they conveyed a sentiment of love. She decided that she was going to transform her food. And in a moment, she transformed her life, and she changed the game. What I'm here to tell you is that you too can change the game and change your life. And that's the time, it's time for us to do that together as a community. It's time for us to do this as a nation and as a world. I'm gonna leave you finally with a great, great philosopher I followed all throughout my childhood. Now, this script is given to none other than Bruce Lee. And he said, knowing is not enough, we must apply. Willing is not enough, we must do. What I'm here to tell you, folks, let's apply, let's do. Because when we do that, when we change our bodies, we change our life, we change our environment, we change the world. When we transform and begin the process of moving from a plant to a plant-predominant diet, we can decrease our greenhouse gas. When we move to a plant-predominant diet, we can decrease the overall U.S. methane generated. We can decrease the water contamination. We can change the game for our life, for our family, and for our health. Thank you.
You know, I have to say my favorite part of that whole presentation was the very end when you referred to Bruce Lee as a philosopher. That's brilliant.
Come on, you didn't know Bruce Lee was a philosopher?
You know, I never really thought about it in those terms. No, absolutely. There's no question about it. That was incredible. There was so much gold in that presentation. The fact that the words stressed and desserts are reciprocals of each other, I didn't, literally when you said that, I was laughing out loud. That was brilliant.
Yeah,
I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. So for those of you, so thank you, by the way, that was really good. We got a lot of questions actually as you were talking. There were a lot of people asking questions. So I want to go into that in 1 second. Before we get there, I want to, I told you guys at the beginning that we're going to, there's a promotion to save 20% at the Forks Over Knives store. So let me just go into that in real quick detail here. And then we can go to the questions in 1 second. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys. Switch over here. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So today what I want to talk with you guys about here is the Forks Over Knives team. I know the Forks Over Knives team very well. I consider them to be personal friends of mine. And I can honestly tell you that their main goal is to make whole food plant-based eating easy, enjoyable, and accessible for literally anybody. They want to see all of you guys living healthy and happy lives in the same way that Dr. Batiste wants you. It's why they do what they do. It's why I do what I do. And most importantly, Forks Over Knives has a ton of products and services that can help you in that transition. Some of my favorite products from Forks Over Knives are their salad dressings, which you can see on the screen right here. They offer a variety of flavors and are all delicious and a very convenient way to get the flavor of a homemade dressing made with truly healthy ingredients. Many of you have tried some of these dressings before, and you probably know how amazing they are. And if you haven't tried them before, then trust me, you guys are missing out, no question. Now, all of the Forks Over Knives salad dressings are free, 100% oil-free, which is hard to find. If you go to the grocery store and you're looking through the aisles, I dare you, look for an oil-free dressing. It's very challenging to get your hands on. All of these are made in the USA by small batch manufacturer, and the recipes are created and tested in-house. And they contain only the highest quality, all natural ingredients, no questions asked. They come beautifully presented, and they feature some of the best flavors to complement any salad or any meal. You'll find balsamic fig as one of their flavors. This is one of my favorites. They also have orange sesame. They also have pomegranate tarragon. I didn't know pomegranate and tarragon were good flavor combinations, but man, they are incredible. And then most recently, Forks Over Knives is now announcing that there's a new flavor that's just been added to the lineup, which is creamy Italian. The classic dressing flavor is seasoned with parsley, with basil, and with thyme. And it gets its creamy texture from cashew butter with a little hint of red wine vinegar to really pop and make that flavor super tasty. So head over to the Forks Over Knives online store by visiting www.forksoverknives.com/store, where you can pick up these incredible dressings. I honestly will tell you they are very tasty. And while you're there, another thing that you can also pick up is the latest edition of the Forks Over Knives magazine. The summer 2019 edition was just released, and it is a brilliant and beautiful magazine. This issue is packed with pages of expert tips, with practical advice, and with inspiring success stories. And in addition to that, there are 72, counted 72, easy and satisfying recipes that put the pleasure in plant-based eating. So this issue is now available in the store, so you can pick that up as well. So in order to save 20%, go to www.forksoverknives.com/shop and use the coupon code SUMMER20. Simply enter the promo code SUMMER20 when you go to the checkout, and 20% is automatically taken off of everything that you purchase in the store. So if you're wanting to stock up on anything that we mentioned here, on information, on recipes, on salad dressings, this is your opportunity. This coupon code is only going to be good until July 29th. So if you are interested in getting 20% off, this is your opportunity to do so. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Okay, let me switch over one more time. All right, you're back with me now. So we got a ton of questions that came in. So let's get to them one by one and really go through them, because I think there's a lot of, you really kind of helped a lot of people think about things in a different manner. Wendy, she says, the ketogenic diet is almost the complete opposite of a plant-based diet. Give us some insight. How detrimental is a ketogenic diet in the long term?
That's a great question. And so a couple things I'll say first to Wendy, and I'm not sure if Wendy adopts a ketogenic diet, is I will tell you, bravo at least to you for getting away from key components of standard American diet. But oftentimes I tell patients and individuals, what question are you asking? So oftentimes the question that one is asking is, how can I lose weight? And so if the question is, how can I lose weight? It may be able to help you lose weight. If your question is, how can I be healthy? How can I stay away from heart disease? Then that is not the answer for you. When we look at studies as it pertains to ketogenic diet, I brought up many areas, but I couldn't touch on them very long. As it pertains to a lot of the animal products, the meat, the dairy, the eggs, the variables that are there, there's growing and mounting evidence, whether or not it's from observational epidemiologic studies showing a distinct correlation between the ingestion of these products and the occurrence of adverse disease events, cancer, diabetes, as well as heart disease. We're seeing now increasing growing evidence as it pertains to the microbiome with TMAO, trimethylamine oxide, and seeing as far as a direct relationship as it pertains to this. And so we can't really contradict the growing and the mountainous evidence that tells us that these food substances are detrimental in the occurrence of hardening of the arteries, of the occurrence of cardiovascular events, the occurrence of diabetes that are there.
Out of curiosity, do you also see that LDL cholesterol in particular, it goes up on a ketogenic diet?
I have seen a spectrum, but I have seen, for the most part, I have seen markedly elevated levels of that. Now, I will be honest, I don't have a large number of patients who are seeking me out, see me individually who are taking a ketogenic diet. So my sample size is not very large. When I perform procedures, I perform them ad hoc on everyone that comes through, and I have a conversation. And so I have observed that during those instances.
Last question here about ketogenic diets. There's also a growing trend towards more plant-based ketogenic diets. So this is, again, very low carbohydrate, but also including many nuts and seeds and olives and avocados and coconuts and sometimes even oil. What types of cardiovascular effects happen on a plant-based ketogenic diet?
So one, I'll give the caveat that I'm not aware specifically of research that's looking at a plant-based ketogenic diet that I can tell you. I can extrapolate out, and what I can tell you is that the ingestion of refined foods, right, and so that oil falls into that category, is indeed detrimental long-term compared to the intake, the avoidance of that. So we know there's some studies, yes, small studies looking at damage of the special lining of the vessels called the endothelium with the intake of oil. We know the calorie count with the oil too as well. We know about all of those things that can be detrimental. We know that when oil is heated, that we change the moiety of that oil too as well, that then leads to toxic effects that are there. We know similarly with excessive amounts of, when we look at nuts and seeds, here's the key, right? Folks, the same as dark chocolate, same as everything, folks in Western society like to go to the extreme. And so we'll say, oh, you know what? Dark chocolate's good for me. Well, the size of a postage stamp without the sugar, mostly cacao, right? You say, oh, well, nuts are good for me. I'm going to have whatever I want. No, about 3 tablespoons worth of unsalted raw if you're going to do it, primarily as far as the seeds that are going to give you as far as your omegas that are there. Yes, your flax, yes, your chias are going to be beneficial. You say, well, we know there's societies that have it, taken in as far as coconut oil. Well, no, predominantly it's the coconut, which is a little bit different. And the key thing is you want to have that fiber. I think, once again, ultimately what I recommend is that, are the foods you're eating, are they health promoting? So in terms of what question are you asking? Am I asking the question, how can I be healthy? If that is my question, how can I avoid chronic disease that we know the vast majority is preventable through lifestyle? Then that means that we eat a consortium of a variety of vegetables and fruits and legumes and various things of that nature. Beans and grains and so forth become extremely important as far as in the dietary spectrum.
Fantastic. That was a phenomenal answer. Judy, she says, what are the 3 best foods to help reduce nutritional stress?
That's a great question. So we know a lot of times, like your fruits, like I mentioned, the blueberries are very good. In that regards, they're going to be very good. You know, your foods that are going to be carbohydrate rich, they're going to give you that sense of satisfaction. We've all kind of gotten through moments. I mean, if I share with you personally, you know, there will be moments where I'm primarily having just salads and I'm just kind of like famished. And it's like, I need something. As soon as I have rich carbohydrate, not saying garbage, right? I'm not talking about highly refined carbohydrates. I'm talking about sweet potatoes. I'm talking about golden Yukon potatoes, purple potatoes. I have a plethora of beans that are there. All of a sudden I feel satisfied. I feel comfortable. I feel it's a new form of comfort food. And so I think I think the key to avoiding nutritional stress is to make sure your body's on full as it relates to health promoting foods. I think when you do that, along with the other avenues, it builds your resiliency that allows you to resist those temptations, which a lot of times are going to be there. Everyone has temptations. I don't care who you are. Everyone has temptations. And you're best suited to deal with those temptations when you're rounded out in terms of your sleep, your nutrition, your exercise as well.
Couldn't agree with you more. Lori asks, how many grams of protein does a woman need per day? Is there like a specific number that women should be trying to target versus men, or is it a range?
So for sure, there's always going to be a range. There's never, I mean, inside of medicine, there's never one formula, one number that's specific to an individual. And exactly. This is a common theme that kind of comes up in terms of your nutritional needs. And to be honest with you, that quite varies if you're an Olympic athlete. If you're a professional athlete, the amount of nutrients that you need in terms of carbohydrates and protein, but we've heard this enough in terms of that you're going to get protein from everything, but not minimizing that role. If you're a bodybuilder, you're going to have to be more intentional as far as in the types of legumes that you're getting in that are going to give you your plant-rich proteins that are there, which are going to be low. They're going to be alkaline. They're not going to be acidic. They're going to help decrease the inflammation. And so I think that you have to really focus on the quality of foods that you're eating, less so than looking at macronutrients, which can be so confusing and it's so time consuming and frustrating.
Okay, so on that same note now, when you're talking about the quality of the food you're eating rather than just looking at the macronutrients, Wendy asked another really very good question here, which is, you said that when you grill meats, yes, you end up producing a lot of these advanced glycation end products, these AGEs, and they can be detrimental. They can cause free radical formation and inflammation in your body. Does the same thing happen when you're grilling vegetables, or is this process, this Maillard reaction, is it only something that pertains to meat?
It's a great question, actually.
It's a phenomenal question.
You find that it does happen with all products, but the amount and the toxicity is magnitudes higher as it relates to your animal products that are there with the proteins, because it's the interaction between the protein and the carbohydrates with the heat that's there that kind of leads to this. So that's a great question, but you don't have the same degree or the worry with the plant-rich proteins.
Exactly right.
And let me be clear as it relates to, because I saw this pop up, and so maybe you're going to get to it, but the difference between vegan, vegetarian, and plant-based is used kind of ubiquitous now. And when I reference plant-based, I'm referring specifically to whole food plant-based, which what I mean by that is foods that have a singular ingredient: broccoli, kale, onions, blueberries. It's not foods that have a consortium of ingredients that have a lot of preservatives and that have shelf life. So studies have been shown that adopting a diet that is quote unquote plant-based, that is unhealthy, is as detrimental, is more detrimental than having animal products as far as in your diet. So
is that right?
Yeah. So there was an article out of the Journal of American College of Cardiology that showed now. So for instance, individuals who take in animal products, but they're eating lots of vegetables and everything else with it, they have one level, but those who are unhealthy plant-based, a lot of chips, so they're vegan, in other words, right?
Sure, vegan, but junk food vegan.
Refined burgers, they do worse than the other. But who does the best, has the lowest burden of disease? The whole food plant-based.
Whole food plant-based eaters.
Recognizable foods that are there.
It's funny because I've heard a lot, and sort of there's a lot of people sort of murmuring about, well, which is worse, eating a meat-based diet or eating a packaged vegan diet? And I would love to read this research, but I've heard both sides of the story, that eating a packaged vegan diet can be more detrimental in the long term, and some people say the opposite, that a meat-based diet is. But I think regardless of which one of those is necessarily worse in the long term, your conclusion is perfectly on point, which is the ideal is to eat a whole food plant-based diet in which you're eating real foods that don't come from packages, and they're mainly from the plant world.
Absolutely. Well, the other add to that just a little bit, as it relates to when we look at, there's plenty of studies that have looked at animal protein versus plant-rich protein, and looking at the occurrence of overall mortality, looking at the overall incidence of cardiovascular events, and time again, it favors plant-rich proteins.
Exactly.
So if I extrapolate that data out and apply it to the plant-based or the processed burger stuff compared to animal, I probably would choose the plant-based, but I don't have specific data that can give me guidance. So I'm clearly blindly extrapolating it based off of that.
Fair enough. Okay. Gigi asked a very good question. She says, if you're going to eat a whole food plant-based diet, how do you avoid nutritional deficiencies, especially B12 and iron?
Yeah. So B12, let's start with B12 because iron's fairly simple in terms of that. You can get, it's from like your veggies. We'll touch on that. But from B12, you will have to supplement, right? So you will have to supplement with B12. But to be honest with you, and we can get into this in terms of like we live in a fairly clean society and environment. We wash everything 20 times and get rid of the bacteria that's going to help with the B12 production. And so our animals used to eat that, but now with their livestocking, less of that. And so I understand there's more and more injection of the animals with B12 to make sure the levels are there. And so you can get B12 from certain components. But I usually recommend supplementing just to ensure that you have it if you are doing if you're definitely intentional in your whole food plant-based approach. I definitely recommend supplementation of that. In terms of the iron, that's going to be that you can get from all of your plant-rich foods, your veggies, your green leafy veggies, dark veggies, some of the beans too as well. And and it's good because you're not getting the heme iron as well, which means it won't potentiate cardiovascular disease, which is beneficial for you. So the iron deficiency is not something that is really discussed or is a concern. I think it's fairly recognized that that's not going to be a major from most folks who are fairly astute as it relates to nutrition to some degree.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I think unfortunately, there's kind of a lot of folklore about the idea that if you eat a plant-based diet, that you can easily develop a nutritional deficiency. Yes. And so I think a lot of people are sort of either timid going into a plant-based diet because of this verbiage that circulates in sort of like modern society. Even though plant-based foods, if you really evaluate them on a nutrient density scale, are orders of magnitude higher than their animal food counterparts. Right. So it's a sort of interesting concept here. Now, here's another fantastic question. If you eat a whole food plant-based or no SOS diet, meaning no salt, no oil, no sugar, and you're eating a sufficient number of calories, Is it possible for your blood pressure to drop to too low of a level? If so, what is considered too low?
It's a great question. So what I characterize as too low is when you're symptomatic. So if standing up, you're lightheaded, if you're walking around with a fog, that I consider as too low. The numbers inherently by themselves can be a little bit misleading as we look at numbers in isolation, meaning the top number, bottom number. What we're really more so concerned about is something we would characterize as the mean arterial pressure, which is a calculation that looks at the systolic, the top number, and the diastolic to see how well the body is being perfused from the efficiency of the heart itself. There are going to be some individuals who have a lower blood pressure inherently, to be honest with you, I have not seen reports. I have not seen on any great deal individuals who have suffered where they're symptomatic low blood pressure as a result of adopting a healthful diet that's free of salt, oil, and sugar and a whole food plant-based. I think I applaud you if you're going down that road and I'd say stick to it. The numbers, once again, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt, the lower your numbers, actually, we know that it's better for you. The lower your incidence of stroke and heart disease, it's not just a cutoff at 120 over 80. The lower, the better. So I get happy when my blood pressure is 110 over 60. I get happy when my heart rate at this age is 50. I get happy. I feel like, okay, you know what? I'm exercising like I should. I'm still eating. I'm on the pathway, and I love the effects of it.
It's funny. I remember now that you're bringing this up, when I went to a recent doctor's visit, my blood pressure was, I think, 108 over 56. Mm-hmm. And I remember the triage nurse at that point took a look at me and was like, "Are you feeling all right?" And I was like, I feel fine. Don't worry about me.
Exactly.
When it comes to salt, what's the difference between Himalayan pink salt and regular table salt? And is there a place for either of them in a whole food plant-based diet?
So, I don't recommend salt. And so when you look at the crystal size and so forth that's there, and that's usually just the surface area. And so, Cyrus, you can kind of correct me with this. I haven't looked in research this anytime recent, but really when you look at the surface size of some of the sea salt or the Himalayan and pink salt, it kind of just transforms as far as the amount of taste buds that it hits, but really the level of sodium that's there. So historically at your garden variety table salt, it's somewhere between 2,000 to 2,300 milligrams of sodium per teaspoon, right? And there's 3 teaspoons per tablespoon. So when you look at that amount, and when we're looking at our refined processed foods in the label, it may say 250 milligrams, but the serving size, there's 10 of them in there, and you eat all 10. So you have to do the math with all of that and try and add it up, and so it becomes a complicated math equation. I generally recommend as you're transitioning, the goal is, like I showed at the very end of that talk, is getting moving, right? From a state of being where you're at and improving every single day as your taste buds transform. And it just takes several weeks for your taste buds to really kind of transform, and you get acclimated to not having the salt in the oil.
Okay, so do you also have a recommendation for the approximate number of milligrams of sodium that one would consider that you as a cardiologist would consider to be acceptable on a daily basis? Is there such a thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first you're going to get sodium inside of multiple food products.
Correct.
So it's going to be there. That's an inherent part of life and minerals and so forth. But usually, as far as the need, it's not more than about 1,500 milligrams. It's less than that. So you're good.
Okay, so 1,500 milligrams is, like you said, 1 teaspoon of salt is 2,000 milligrams. So we're literally looking for the equivalent of like 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt per day, but not from a bottle containing a white crystal, instead from Whole Foods.
Correct.
Exactly. Okay. Oh, looks like our cat wants to join us today. Okay, so I think we got time for maybe 2 more questions here. JC asks, I think you had touched on this, but let's go into a little more detail here. Can you elaborate on the consumption of nuts if you have heart disease? Is there an upper limit for how much to eat per day, or would you recommend avoiding nuts and seeds altogether?
So that's a great question. And I understand that there's a little bit of discussion within the plant-based realm.
Absolutely.
And so forth. So let me acknowledge that. And so there are some who kind of advocate zero ingestion of any nuts or seeds and so forth. I think, and I'll be honest, at one point I advocated that strongly. As I look at the literature as a whole, and let me extend this comment a lot. So as early in my journey, and I've been vegetarian forever, I've been whole food plant-based for about 10 years. And so early in my journey, I would say, oh, I eat nuts or whatever else, but I know myself. I'll eat a whole can of nuts, snacking on them. And I know my limitations. I know I don't have that control. So what I recommend to folks now, like I'll have walnuts in my office that I'll sprinkle on top of my oatmeal, or that I'll add in very small amounts to make sure 3 tablespoons or less, right? So when you look at nuts versus a granular substance like salt, 3 tablespoons is not very much, right? And so at that point, for the omega use, the omegas, it's going to be beneficial for you. It's going to have the fiber. The digestion is going to be slowed inside in your system as opposed to being liquid. I do not recommend oils or refined products whatsoever, but I don't have evidence distinctly. And I know that there was some trial, I haven't had a chance to read on it to really go into great detail, that kind of reference about the impact of nuts on the cardiovascular system. And that may lead me to change my thought and go back to where I started, which is avoiding all nuts and seeds. But right now, based on what my awareness is, I recommend seeds preferable to nuts. I recommend if you sprinkle it, unsalted, unroasted, unoiled, for sure.
100%. Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of controversy right now, even within the whole food plant-based world, about whether nuts are necessary, whether nuts are recommended, or whether nuts should be avoided. So I do agree with you, and I think maybe many of our viewers have also seen the sort of controversy that seems to be unfolding these days. But there's a lot of evidence-based research to show that small amounts of nuts and seeds on the order of a couple tablespoons per day is perfectly healthy. Nutrient-dense foods, they got a high micronutrient value, no question. But just like Dr. Batiste was saying, it's very tempting to start to eat larger and larger quantities before a couple tablespoons turns into a handful, turns into a cupful, turns into a plateful. And before you know it, now you're just taking on too many calories, which can lead to a number of chronic problems.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Last question. Can you talk to us about blending fruits and juicing? Are you an advocate of either one of those, or would you recommend eating foods instead of blending or juicing?
It's a great question, and it's interesting that I'm answering the question in the presence of Cyrus here. But but my thoughts are distinctly always eating, right? Eating the foods, period. First and foremost, a lot of foods, and I won't even pretend to know.
Uh-oh, did we lose Dr. Batiste?
Uh-oh, did you?
Okay. Yeah, we lost you. You said, I won't even pretend to know, and then it cut out. So maybe if you can go back to that.
Sorry about that. Yeah,
no
so I always recommend eating, first and foremost. We know that there's certain foods that your body processes by just the process of mastication. When you begin the process of chewing, and the hormones and saliva in your system interacts with the foods that we eat, predominantly a lot of the vegetables and the cruciferous vegetables, but also fruit. I think the next level of that, when we look at blending too as well with the fiber, what you have to realize is the fact that although it may have some benefit, you're still retaining some of the benefit in the fiber that's there. Your satiety is not going to be the same, which means the caloric amount that you're going to intake is going to still be likely higher, because you may drink whatever the smoothie is, and then you may follow that up with eating something else, especially if you're transitioning to a whole food plant-based diet. And that's why we typically will recommend for your smoothies having more green leafy vegetables than fruit inside of it. And then last, to avoid, I would say the juicing, right? Because you're extrapolating out all of the nutrients, all of the micronutrients that are there, the phytochemicals, that I would not advocate at all. Right? I mean, no one on earth is perfect, but if you can avoid it as much as possible, I would avoid the juices and drink the water. I would eat preferably, and as a secondary alternative would be the smoothies that have been blended, if you're going to go that route, but having awareness of what that means.
Yes, I think you nailed it. When it comes to this whole idea of juicing and blending, fiber is your friend. Dr. Batiste has talked a lot about the microbiome. Including fiber is a very important strategy in this world of whole food plant-based nutrition, because fiber is a food for your microbiome, for trillions and trillions and trillions of bacteria inside of your large intestine. You consume the fiber, you can't break it down because you don't have the enzymatic machinery, but your bacteria does. When they consume fiber, they take the glucose units out, they metabolize them, they create these things called short chain fatty acids, and it's actually very beneficial for many tissues in your body. So whenever possible, keep that fiber inside, just like he's saying, and that's going to give you the best results, no questions asked.
Perfect.
Okay, so Dr. Batiste, this was awesome. I learned a ton, and I know that our audience also got a really good idea here. Is the link between the foods that they're eating and the stress that they can either induce by eating particular types of foods, or ways that they can resolve that stress if they find it present in their life in the first place. And for those of you that are still with us, we still have 292 people here. Remember, the Forks Over Knives team is offering 20% off of everything inside of the store. So simply go to forksoverknives.com/shop and enter the promo code SUMMER20. That's SUMMER20. Do it anytime between now and July 29th. Stock up on anything that you need for the summer, and then make healthy eating an easy way of life. Okay. Remember that. Make healthy eating an easy way of life. If you can do that, you're going to set yourself up for success. And then one day you're going to look and feel just like this guy over here. So thanks so much for being here with us today, Dr. Batiste.
Hey, thanks for having me. I love it. It's a great time.
Absolutely. It was really good. So we'll see you guys all next time for the next webinar. And in the meantime, eat the most nutrient-dense diet you possibly can. Have a great day, guys.
Take care.